There are moments in life when words lose their power, when explanations, debates, and arguments no longer shift the situation, and in those moments, silence speaks louder than any sentence ever could. Silence isn't weakness, silence isn't surrender, silence is strategy. It's the ultimate signal that you no longer need to convince anyone of your worth because your value speaks for itself. When you go silent, the noise that used to distract him, the comfort of your constant presence, your reassurances, your effort, suddenly disappears, and in that void something begins to stir. He starts to hear you, not because you're speaking, but because your absence of words amplifies the truth he ignored. The silence becomes an echo, one he can't escape, one that forces him to confront what he's been unwilling to face. You see, silence demands attention in a way that arguments never could. Words can be dismissed, twisted, or deflected, but silence is undeniable. Silence creates a mirror, and in that mirror he sees his actions, his choices, his neglect. The very thing he once overlooked becomes the thing he now obsesses over, and the longer you stay quiet, the louder the message becomes. I don't need to explain myself. My silence says it all. This isn't about manipulation. It's about reclamation. It's about choosing peace over chaos, dignity over desperation, and strength over struggle. Silence is the language of self-respect, and when you embrace it, you shift the entire dynamic. You no longer fight for recognition, you embody it. You no longer plead for love, you command it, and that shift shakes him to his core. So, remember this, silence is not emptiness, it's presence, it's power. It's proof that you don't need to raise your voice to be heard, because the absence of your words is louder than anything you could ever say. When you go silent, he doesn't just hear you, he feels you, and in that feeling he begins to recognize the weight of what he stands to lose. Silence is often misunderstood. Many people think that when someone goes silent, it means they've given up, that they've surrendered, or that they have nothing left to say. But the truth is, silence can be one of the most powerful expressions of strength. It's not about weakness. It's about choosing not to waste energy where it no longer belongs. It's about reclaiming control of your voice by realizing you don't need to keep proving yourself to someone who wasn't listening in the first place. When you stop talking, when you stop defending, when you stop explaining, you send a message stronger than any argument could carry. That message is, I know my value and I refuse to spend it on someone who doesn't recognize it. Think about it. Words can be debated, twisted, and even ignored, but silence leaves no room for denial. It leaves space that cannot be filled with excuses or distractions. And in that space, the other person begins to notice what was once taken for granted. Silence forces them to feel the absence of your presence. They no longer hear your laughter, your comfort, your encouragement, or your reminders. And suddenly, what was once considered normal becomes a gaping void. That void is not weakness. That void is the echo of your strength. When you choose silence, you also choose self-respect. It takes courage to walk away from the cycle of constant explaining and trying to be understood. It takes strength to say nothing, to let your actions and your absence speak for you. Silence is not passive. It is an active decision to rise above the noise. It means you trust yourself enough to know that you don't have to keep proving your worth to anyone. And in that trust, there's a quiet power that commands attention without asking for it. Silence also creates boundaries. By refusing to engage in endless back and forth battles, you draw a clear line. You will not sacrifice your peace for someone else's comfort. You teach others how to treat you, not by what you say, but by what you refuse to tolerate. Silence teaches that respect is not negotiable. It says, I will not lower myself to be heard by someone who refuses to listen. If you want my presence, then earn it. If you want my voice, then value it. That is not weakness. That is strength in its purest form, and here's the most powerful part. Silence shifts the balance of energy. When you stop pouring all of your effort into being heard, you conserve that energy for yourself. You redirect it toward healing, toward growth, toward rediscovering your own power. That shift changes everything because the moment you stop giving your energy away freely, the other person feels it. They feel the absence of your voice, your attention, your love, and in that moment, your silence becomes the loudest sound they've ever heard. It becomes impossible to ignore, and it forces them to reckon with the truth: you were never weak. You were always strong enough to choose when to speak, and stronger still when you chose not to. Silence creates a void that cannot be ignored. When you take a step back and stop filling the space with your words, your presence, your energy, something powerful happens. He begins to feel the emptiness left behind. This is not the kind of void that can be distracted away or pushed aside. It lingers. It stirs emotions he may have never confronted before. When you were there, your voice and your actions acted like a steady background rhythm in his life. It was comforting, even if he never admitted it. It was reliable, even if he didn't show appreciation. But when that rhythm suddenly stops, the silence feels louder than anything else. It presses on his mind, demanding his attention, forcing him to see what he's been missing. At first, he may try to ignore it. He might bury himself in distractions, in work, in friends, or even in other noise. But no matter what he does, there's a difference that he can't quite shake off. That difference is you. And the silence you've created becomes a constant reminder that something has shifted. The words he once took for granted are no longer there. The comfort he assumed was endless is no longer available. The effort you gave so generously is no longer flowing his way, and that absence screams louder than any fight or confrontation ever could. The void silence creates is also a mirror. When you stop speaking, when you stop explaining, he is left to confront his own thoughts. There's nothing left to argue against, nothing to defend himself from, nothing to drown out your truth. In that silence, he hears his own conscience. He hears the weight of his decisions and the echoes of moments where he should have listened but didn't. It's in that silence that he begins to truly hear you, not your words, but the impact of your absence. He starts to replay conversations, moments, and choices in his mind, because there's nothing external to shield him from himself. And the longer the silence lasts, the stronger the void becomes. What was once overlooked now becomes the focus of his attention. He starts to wonder why the laughter is gone, why the calls have stopped, why the energy feels different. He begins to question what he did or didn't do that created this shift, and in that questioning, the realization slowly sinks in. He didn't just lose your words, he lost access to your presence, your support, your essence. That recognition cuts deeper than anything you could have ever said, because it's not you telling him, it's him discovering it for himself. This is why silence is so powerful. It doesn't fight, it doesn't argue, it doesn't explain. It simply creates a space so undeniable that he is forced to acknowledge what has changed. Silence makes him notice you in a way he never did before. It turns the ordinary into extraordinary simply because it's missing. And in that void, he starts to hear you clearer than he ever did when you were speaking. Silence has a way of commanding respect in ways words often cannot. When you go silent, you're not just choosing not to speak. You're choosing to step into your own power. You're sending a message that says, I will not waste my energy trying to be heard by someone who refuses to listen. That choice shifts the dynamic completely. Suddenly, the one who thought they had control begins to feel the imbalance. They can no longer rely on your constant giving, your explanations, or your reassurances. Instead, they are confronted with the weight of your absence, and that weight demands respect. Respect doesn't always come from loud declarations or constant reminders. In fact, the more we try to force someone to respect us, the less likely it is to happen. But silence has a unique power it cannot be argued with. There are no loopholes to exploit, no words to twist, no explanations to dismiss. It is simply there, undeniable and unshakable. In that silence, the other person is left to wrestle with themselves. They are forced to notice that the energy they once relied on is no longer accessible, and that realization alone creates a shift in how they see you. Think about the moments in life when someone's absence suddenly felt louder than their presence. That's what happens when you go silent. The respect begins to grow not because you demanded it, but because your silence proves you don't need validation to know your worth. You're no longer playing the game of chasing acknowledgement or begging for attention. Instead, you've taken a higher road, and that alone commands recognition. Even if it takes time, the other person begins to see that your silence was not weakness. It was strength wrapped in dignity. What silence also does is remove the option for excuses. When you no longer engage, when you stop explaining yourself or trying to prove your perspective, the other person can't use your words against you. They can't argue with you because there's nothing to argue with. That quiet forces them to face the reality they've been avoiding, and in that reality, respect becomes almost inevitable. They may not admit it right away, but deep down they begin to understand that it takes immense self-control and self-belief to stay silent rather than fight. And people always respect what they cannot control. Over time, your silence reshapes the relationship dynamic. The energy shifts from you constantly giving to you standing tall in your own power. The more consistent you are, the more undeniable the message becomes. They start to see you differently, not as someone they can take for granted, but as someone whose presence is valuable, whose energy is rare, and whose voice is not owed. It is a gift, and in that realization, respect is born. It's not forced, it's not demanded, it's naturally earned because silence taught them what your words never could, that your worth is undeniable even when you're not speaking. When you choose silence, something powerful begins to happen. Space is created. And in that space, reflection takes root. People often drown in noise, filling every moment with words, distractions, and justifications. But when you stop speaking, when you withdraw your constant explanations and energy, it creates a stillness that cannot be ignored. That stillness becomes a mirror, one that reflects everything he has overlooked, dismissed, or failed to acknowledge. Silence forces him to sit with his own thoughts, his own actions, and his own behavior, because there is no longer your voice there to soften the blow, to explain, or to rescue him from his own accountability. Reflection in silence is often uncomfortable, but it is also unavoidable. At first, he might try to fight it, telling himself stories to avoid the truth. He might distract himself, surround himself with people, or keep busy so he doesn't have to feel the weight of the quiet. But no matter how hard he tries, the silence lingers, pressing against him, reminding him that something is missing. And in those quiet moments, when the noise fades and he is left alone, that is when the reflection begins. He starts to replay past conversations, moments where he could have listened better, times when he dismissed your needs, and instances when he thought you'd always be there no matter how he acted. The absence of your voice becomes the presence of his conscience. He begins to hear not only the echoes of what you once said, but also the silence of what you are no longer willing to repeat. That shift is profound because reflection isn't about what's happening externally, it's about what's happening internally. And silence has the unique ability to open that internal door. Without you constantly filling the air with words, he is left to confront what he tried to avoid. Reflection becomes his only option, and through that reflection comes realization. The more he reflects, the more he starts to connect the dots. He sees patterns he ignored before. He realizes how much you were contributing, not just through words, but through actions, presence, and energy. Silence makes him notice the contrast, the difference between life with you fully present and life with you pulled back. And it's often in that contrast that he comes to understand what he truly had. Reflection isn't always immediate. It can take time, days, weeks, sometimes even longer. But once it begins, it's hard to stop because silence has a way of amplifying truth. And here's the real power. Reflection doesn't just change the way he sees you, it changes the way he sees himself. Silence makes him recognize not just your worth, but also the gaps in his own behavior. It forces him to ask questions he might have avoided. Why did I take that for granted? Why didn't I listen when I had the chance? Why did I assume it would always be this way? These questions linger in his mind, and the silence ensures they are not drowned out. It becomes a turning point where he either chooses to grow or risks losing what he now realizes he values deeply. And it all begins because silence created the space for reflection. When silence enters the room, something even deeper begins to unfold. It creates a longing. Words can sometimes overwhelm, constant presence can sometimes be taken for granted. But when you go silent, the absence of your voice, your energy, your presence becomes a void that he cannot escape. Human beings are wired to crave what they no longer have easy access to. And when you are no longer readily available, when the conversations stop, when the laughter fades, and when the sound of your reassurance disappears, the mind begins to ache for what is missing. That ache is longing, and it is one of the most powerful emotional forces a person can experience. In the beginning, he might try to dismiss it. He might convince himself that he doesn't need your words or your presence. But silence has a way of lingering. It stretches through hours, days, weeks, and the longer it stretches, the more noticeable it becomes. What was once overlooked now feels like an empty space. The silence becomes louder than any words you could have spoken, and that loudness triggers memory. He starts to recall the little things, how you listened without judgment, how your energy filled the space, how your voice brought comfort in chaos. The longing builds because those things can no longer be felt in real time. They exist only in memory. Longing is powerful because it creates appreciation. It makes him see that what he once brushed aside was actually invaluable. The absence highlights the depth of what was there all along. Silence makes him aware of what he cannot recreate elsewhere because it was unique to you. He may seek distraction, he may look for replacements, but nothing fits, nothing feels the same, and that void only deepens the longing. This is why silence often works in ways words never could. It bypasses logic and dives straight into emotion. You can argue with words, but you cannot argue with the feeling of missing someone. As the longing grows, so does the desire to reconnect. He begins to wonder what it would take to hear your voice again, to feel your energy in the room again, to know that you are present again. Silence creates this craving because it forces contrast. It strips away what was once familiar and shows him what life looks like without it. That stark difference makes him yearn for the very things he may have once ignored. Longing is born out of contrast, and silence is the catalyst that makes the contrast impossible to ignore. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of longing created by silence is that it doesn't just affect how he feels about you. It affects how he sees himself. He realizes that without you, without your energy, something feels incomplete, something feels off balance. The silence makes him reflect not only on your value, but on the emptiness that comes from his choices. It pushes him to face the consequences of taking you for granted, and that inner void becomes the motivation that drives him to look inward, to change, and to reach out in ways he never did before. All because silence, in its quiet but commanding way, created the longing that words could never achieve. Silence carries with it a transformative power that words often fail to achieve. It creates change. When you stop speaking, stop repeating yourself, stop justifying, stop trying to be heard in a place where your voice has been ignored, your silence forces a shift. At first it feels unsettling, almost disruptive, because it breaks the usual rhythm. But that disruption is exactly what sparks change. Silence communicates on a level that no speech can. It sends a message that you are no longer willing to participate in a dynamic where you are not valued, and that message begins to alter the balance of the relationship. Change born out of silence begins with awareness. When the noise stops, when your presence is no longer constant, when the patterns he relied on to feel secure disappear, awareness rises. He realizes things are not the same. He starts to notice how empty the space feels, how quiet the environment has become, how different the energy is without your contribution. That awareness stirs discomfort, and discomfort is often the first step toward transformation. Silence pushes him to see what has been ignored for too long and to recognize that something must shift. Then comes responsibility. Silence removes the option of deflecting blame or avoiding accountability, because you are no longer there to carry the weight of the conversations. There are no arguments to distract him, no explanations to dismiss, no reassurance to lean on. All that's left is himself and the recognition of his own choices. This is where change becomes possible, because silence doesn't just highlight your absence, it magnifies his responsibility in creating it. He has to ask himself difficult questions, and in those questions lies the opportunity for growth. Over time, silence inspires action. When words are no longer available, when access to your energy is no longer guaranteed, he begins to feel the urgency of making things right. Change doesn't always come immediately, but silence ensures it cannot be avoided forever. It forces him to move beyond complacency, to step out of patterns that no longer serve him, and to make decisions he may have resisted before. Silence acts as a catalyst that shakes the foundation and demands something different to emerge. But the deepest change silence creates is within you. It reminds you of your own power. It shows you that you do not always have to speak to be heard, that you do not have to over-explain to prove your worth, that sometimes the strongest statement is made when you choose not to make one at all. Silence changes the dynamic because it shifts the energy back into your hands. It declares without words that you are no longer willing to settle for less than what you deserve. And that inner change is what transforms everything else. In the end, silence is not about punishment. It is about clarity. It clears away the noise, forces awareness, demands responsibility, and ignites transformation. It is a reset button, a silent but powerful force that can create the kind of change words alone could never accomplish. And once change takes root, nothing is ever quite the same again. When you think about everything we've uncovered, the message becomes crystal clear. Silence is not weakness, it's strength. It's not avoidance, it's strategy. It's not about shutting down, it's about rising above. When you go silent, you shift the entire dynamic without raising your voice, without arguing, without demanding. You create space for reflection, for awareness, and for recognition. That space becomes the mirror that forces him to see what has been missing all along, you. And in that realization, the journey of transformation begins. Silence makes its mark because it's undeniable. Words can be ignored, arguments can be dismissed, but silence cannot be escaped. It lingers, it stretches, it grows louder with every passing moment, and in that loudness it begins to uncover truths. It makes him miss what was once taken for granted, it makes him long for what he cannot replicate elsewhere, and it makes him realize that what you brought into his life cannot simply be replaced. That realization is where change starts, and that is the gift silence delivers. But here's what's even more powerful. Silence doesn't just change him, it changes you. It gives you back your power. It reminds you that you don't need to keep proving your worth or fighting to be heard. You already are enough, and by stepping into silence, you step into clarity. You start to see who values you without needing reminders, who shows up when the noise disappears, and who remains when the easy access is gone. Silence doesn't just test him, it reveals the truth to you, and when truth is revealed, decisions become clear. Silence draws the line between what you will tolerate and what you won't. It forces growth on both sides. He must face the discomfort of missing you, and you must embrace the strength of honoring yourself. Out of that, new possibilities emerge. Either he changes or you choose a different path. Either way, silence creates the shift that words could not achieve. It brings clarity, it builds strength, and it empowers you to move forward with confidence, regardless of the outcome. So the conclusion is simple but powerful. Silence is not about absence, it's about presence. It's about being so deeply rooted in your own worth that you no longer need to shout to be heard. You no longer need to chase to be seen. When you go silent, he starts to hear you in ways he never did before. And whether he rises to meet that silence with change, or you rise above it to embrace a new chapter, you win. Because silence gave you the truth, and truth will always set you free. Thank you for sharing this time with me today. Thank you for opening your mind and your heart to a message that isn't just about silence, but about power, presence, and truth. What we explored together is more than words. It's a reminder that your value doesn't need to be shouted to be recognized. Sometimes the strongest message you'll ever send is the one you never say out loud. I want you to leave here today knowing that your silence is not emptiness, it's fullness. It's a sign that you trust yourself, that you respect your own boundaries, and that you will no longer settle for being unheard. That kind of strength will carry you into every area of your life, not just in relationships, but in the way you lead, the way you grow, and the way you step into your future. So as I close, I want to thank you again deeply for giving me your attention and your energy. You've shown up today for yourself, and that in itself is a powerful choice. My hope is that you walk away with more than inspiration. you walk away with clarity, confidence, and the courage to let silence work in your favor when needed. Remember this: the world hears you even in your quietest moments, because your presence is that powerful, and anyone who truly values you will never need to be shouted at to listen. They'll hear you the moment your voice fades. With gratitude and respect, I say goodbye for now. Stay strong, stay true, and never forget that your silence can speak louder than any words. Until we connect again, take care of yourself and keep honoring your worth.